Everyone who's been there has a version of the same sentence. I gave everything I had. And then one day, I just stopped. Not dramatically. There was no argument that triggered it, no single event, no decision you can point to and say, that's when it happened. You woke up, or you drove home, or you sat across from someone who needed something, and you reached for whatever it was you always gave. And it wasn't there. You weren't angry. You weren't hurt. You were just done. And the obvious explanation, the one that makes complete, logical sense, is exhaustion. Depletion. The tank hit empty. You gave too much for too long. And eventually, by some basic arithmetic, there was nothing left to give. You ran out. The end. Makes sense. Anyone looking at that situation from the outside would reach the same conclusion. You would have reached it yourself. You probably did. Carl Jung looked at that moment, and what he found wasn't what it looked like from the outside, not even close. There are layers here. The deeper you go, the more the obvious explanation starts to look like a map that was drawn wrong from the beginning. And the final layer, the one Jung spent years trying to articulate, is the part that determines everything about what that moment becomes. Not what it was, what it becomes. Because those are two different questions, and most people never realize they're asking the wrong one. We're going in. One thing before we go deeper. If you found this video, you probably arrived here by some specific route, something you recognized, something that made you stay. Subscribe if this is the kind of content you want the algorithm to keep bringing you, because what's coming in the next layers is the part most people who've been through that moment never actually hear. This channel is built entirely for the second look, the one that changes what you thought you already understood. But here's what's wrong with the tank hit empty. It's not that it's false. From the inside, that's exactly what it felt like. But empty describes a subjective sensation, not the psychic mechanism that produced it. And when you mistake the sensation for the mechanism, you misread what happened. You misread where it came from, and you misread what it means. Jung's work on psychic energy, particularly his 1928 essay On Psychic Energy, part of the collected volume on the structure and dynamics of the psyche, operates on a principle that the depletion model doesn't account for at all. The principle is this: psychic energy doesn't disappear. It obeys something analogous to the laws of thermodynamics. When energy is pushed intensely in one direction, when one attitude in the conscious mind becomes extreme, becomes the organizing center of how a person moves through the world, the opposite energy doesn't evaporate. It accumulates. On the other side, in the unconscious, with a pressure that builds in proportion to exactly how extreme and how long-sustained the conscious attitude has become. Now think about what an extreme, long-sustained conscious attitude looks like in the person we're describing. The one who always answers, who holds other people's pain carefully, like something that will break if you set it down wrong. The one who stays when the conversation gets hard, who calls back when others stop, who notices, genuinely, involuntarily, without choosing to, what the person across from them actually needs, often before that person knows how to ask for it. Think about what it means to live inside that posture for years, not days, not months, years. To be the person everyone calls. To wake up some mornings already oriented around what someone else is going to need today. To absorb grief, tension, distress, conflict, and to do that work so automatically that it barely registers as work. It just feels like who you are. It feels like care. It feels like strength even. That posture, applied for years without interruption, without a corresponding internal space for what comes back, without limits, the conscious mind enforces. Jung's framework says something very specific about what was happening underneath the entire time. Think about what that actually means over a long enough timeline. Every time you absorbed someone's pain and didn't discharge it, didn't process it, didn't set it down somewhere it could resolve, it went somewhere. Every time you said, "I'm fine," when you weren't, because someone else needed your attention more urgently. Every time you reached toward distress that wasn't yours and took something of it into yourself, because that's what you do, because that's who you are. Every night you drove home carrying more than you arrived with. It doesn't disappear. That's the thing the depletion model gets wrong. The opposite was building. Not emptying, building. Accumulating energy with a pressure proportional to exactly how one-sided and how long-sustained the conscious posture had become. Not visible, not felt as pressure, because the conscious attitude was holding it down, absorbing it, routing it somewhere it couldn't register. But there, accumulating. Jung called what eventually happens forced compensation, a corrective response generated not by willpower, not by a decision you made, not by reaching a logical conclusion about what was sustainable, but by the architecture of the psyche itself. The structure doing what the conscious mind refused to do for years. The tank wasn't running out. Something else was reaching its limit. Something on the other side, in the place you couldn't see. And when it hit the threshold, it broke through. But wait, because that's still only the first layer. And the second one changes the frame completely. Jung had a word for the specific phenomenon that occurs when accumulated opposite pressure finally exceeds the ego's capacity to hold it back. He called it Enantiodromia. He borrowed the concept from Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher who observed, over 2,000 years ago, that anything driven to an extreme eventually becomes its opposite. The river that overflows its banks, the ascetic who breaks into excess. Jung was not making a philosophical observation about historical cycles. He was describing a precise, reproducible psychic mechanism he had documented repeatedly. In clinical patients over decades, in historical and literary figures he studied, and eventually in himself. He wrote this in his 2 essays on analytical psychology. This characteristic phenomenon practically always occurs when an extreme, one-sided tendency dominates conscious life. In time, an equally powerful counterposition is built up, which first inhibits the conscious performance and subsequently breaks through the conscious control. Read that slowly. Breaks through the conscious control. Not, you got tired. Not, you made a decision. Not, you finally gave yourself permission to stop. The opposite force, accumulated in the unconscious over the exact period during which you held the extreme conscious position, reached a threshold the ego could no longer maintain, and then it broke through. This is what forced compensation looks like when it arrives. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't negotiate. It doesn't check whether it's a good time or whether you're ready. You reach for what was always there, and it isn't. And what's there instead is something that feels like loss or numbness or a version of yourself you don't quite recognize. You feel the absence of what used to be automatic, the caring that came without effort, the reaching toward other people's distress that was just part of how you were wired, or so you thought. And now there's a space where that used to be, and you don't know what to call it. Charles Figley, one of the clinicians who most rigorously mapped what happens to caregivers at the outer edge of sustainable empathic engagement, documented in 1995 what he described as the saturation threshold, the point beyond which the empathic engagement of a person who prioritizes others' pain shifts from functional to toxically unilateral. His clinical finding was direct. The breaking point is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence that the nervous system reached the outer limit of its capacity to process absorbed pain without integration. The threshold was real. It had always been real. You hit it. And then he noted something that I've kept coming back to. The breaking point, in the cases he studied, clinically precedes recovery, not causes recovery, precedes it. It is an initiating event, the psyche's corrective mechanism arriving, not as catastrophe, but as the beginning of a different sequence. The tank hitting empty was never the end, but knowing that the mechanism was structural doesn't tell you what comes next, because what comes next is not automatic. And this is the part that Jung spent years trying to articulate, that most people who've survived this moment never encounter. Stay with me, because here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable. Jung made a distinction that most people who've been through that moment will never hear, a distinction that separates two completely different fates from the same starting point, the same trigger, the same quality of something breaking through what was holding it back. Two completely different destinations. The distinction is this: Enantiodromia without awareness. Enantiodromia with awareness. When enantiodromia happens without a map, when the compensatory force breaks through and the person has no framework for what just occurred, the unconscious opposite doesn't integrate. It replaces. The person who spent years giving becomes the person who cannot give. The one who felt everything starts feeling very little. The softness goes hard in a way that doesn't soften back. The availability becomes unavailability. The person who used to reach toward other people's pain instinctively starts pulling back from it and doesn't quite know why, and can't locate the choice that produced it because there wasn't one. And this is not dramatic. That's what makes it so easy to miss. It doesn't announce itself. You don't feel a transformation. You gradually notice the care that used to arrive automatically requires a kind of deliberate reaching that it never did before, and even the reaching doesn't always work. The patience that felt unlimited turns out to have had a ceiling you didn't know about. The people you used to pour yourself into don't register the way they did. Not because you stopped caring about them in some abstract sense, but because the mechanism that translated caring into action seems to have changed. You feel a distance. Where closeness used to be relatively easy, there's a distance now that you keep running into. And then you start calling it one of two things. Some people call it damage. They assume they broke. That something got depleted in a way that can't be refilled, that they gave so much for so long that the capacity itself is now gone. And they spend months, sometimes years, trying to figure out how to get it back, trying to refill the tank, trying to return to what they were before. Other people call it healing. They've read enough to know that boundaries are healthy, that putting yourself first is correct, that the person they were before was overextending, and so the distance must be progress. Surely this is what healed looks like. Surely this is the version of themselves they were always supposed to be. The problem is that without the map, you cannot tell which it is. Jung called this possession by the opposite. The compensatory force that broke through the ego's control doesn't stop once it breaks through. Without consciousness, without the recognition of what it is, where it came from, what it was correcting, it keeps going. It doesn't reach equilibrium and stabilize. It overshoots. The person who was pathologically overextending becomes, without intending to, pathologically closed, not healed, replaced, one extreme traded for another. The same structural unilaterality, the same absence of integration, just pointed in the opposite direction now. That is the version of this story that nobody tells. And what makes it so difficult to see from the inside is that both paths feel like the same thing initially. They both feel like relief. The cessation of the constant outward orientation. The reprieve from being the one who always shows up, always absorbs, always carries. That relief is real in both versions. Whether possession or individuation is what's actually happening underneath, the surface sensation in the weeks and months after the breaking point can be nearly identical, which is why the map matters so much. But Jung documented the other version too, and the difference in what produces it is not strength of character, or how much therapeutic work you've done, or whether you're a psychologically sophisticated person. The difference is something far more specific, and far more accessible. When enantiodromia happens with awareness, when the compensatory force breaks through and the person has or can develop a framework for what just occurred, the same mechanism becomes something entirely different. It becomes the beginning of individuation. Jung knew this firsthand. In 1912 and 1913, following his rupture with Freud, after years of being the devoted heir, the faithful protege, the one who had carried another man's intellectual system forward while subordinating his own questions to someone else's framework, Jung hit his own enantiodromia. The unilateral posture of devoted discipleship finally compensated. The opposite broke through. And what followed, what he describes in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, was not a triumphant awakening. He was careful about that. He described profound inner disorientation, loss of direction so complete that he didn't know where his center was, a sense that something had dissolved without anything arriving to replace it, months of psychic freefall, the sense of moving through a landscape he didn't recognize, without a fixed point. He called it a period of inner uncertainty. He chose those words deliberately, I think, because the alternatives would have been easier, and he didn't use them. He didn't call it breakdown. He didn't call it failure. He didn't frame it as the dark before a dawn, because that framing smuggles in a promise he wasn't ready to make. He called it inner uncertainty, which is exactly what it was. Not the end, not the passage to something predetermined, but a territory he didn't have a map for yet, and was going to have to develop one. And in that period, in the middle of not knowing what he was, without the external structure of the relationship with Freud, without the identity of heir apparent that had organized his professional life, he turned toward it. He engaged the disorientation deliberately. He started the Red Book, the document that records over more than a decade his direct engagement with figures and forces that emerged from his own unconscious during this period. He treated the uncertainty not as a problem to survive, but as material, as the thing that needed to be engaged. What came out of that engagement, out of that specific willingness to turn toward the interior landscape rather than away from it, to give the experience a name rather than simply endure it, became Analytical Psychology, the map that has given millions of people a framework for their own inner lives. The concepts of the unconscious, individuation, the shadow, the self. They arrived because Jung treated his own Enantiodromia as the beginning of something, not the end. The same mechanism, the same triggering moment, the same quality of the opposite, breaking through what was holding it back. But Jung had a name for what was happening. Not immediately. He developed one. In the middle of it, over time, and the name changed what the experience became. Now go back for a second, to where we started. The tank hit empty. You know now what was incomplete about that. It wasn't emptiness. It was pressure. The opposite had been accumulating for years, in proportion to exactly how one-sided and how sustained your conscious posture had become. What you called running out was the moment that accumulated pressure exceeded what the ego could hold back. Forced compensation. The psyche's corrective mechanism, arriving not because you failed, but because the configuration had become so extreme that structural correction was inevitable. The tank hit empty is the sensation from the inside. It describes the experience accurately, but it says nothing about the mechanism, and the mechanism is the only thing that determines what the moment means. Because if the moment is, the tank hit empty, then the only relevant question is how to refill. And you might spend months trying to refill it, never quite understanding why the refilling feels off, why something is still displaced, why the caring that used to be automatic still hasn't quite returned the way you expected. You're solving for the wrong thing. You're reading a map of the sensation, not of the territory. But if the moment is Enantiodromia, forced compensation, the accumulated opposite breaking through, then the relevant question changes completely. Not how to return to what was before, how to understand what the break was pointing toward. The phrase was convenient. It explained the experience without requiring you to understand it. And without understanding it, the moment has no destination. It's just something that happened. I want to tell you about a specific evening, months after I left hospice work. I've mentioned the burnout itself before, and I'm not returning to that. What I haven't talked about is the particular night when the mechanism finally got named for me. When what had felt like a wound started to look like something with a structure. I wasn't working. I wasn't in crisis. I was past crisis, into the strange, flat territory that comes after. Not drowning anymore, but not sure what I was now. Several months out of hospice, not sleeping well, not engaging with much, doing a reasonably convincing imitation of a person who was fine. and I was reading Memories, Dreams, Reflections for the first time. Someone had handed it to me weeks before I left, and I hadn't touched it. That evening, I picked it up. I got to the chapter on his confrontation with the unconscious. The period after Freud, the 1912 to 1917 period that Jung described as his internal freefall. And I stopped reading. Not because the language was difficult. I stopped because he was describing a landscape I recognized, not the specific content. His circumstances and mine had nothing in common. The grief I had accumulated in hospice was not the intellectual grief of losing a mentor figure, and the particular kind of unilaterality I had maintained was not devotion to another person's system, but the structure of the territory he was describing, the loss of direction, the strange quality of the uncertainty, the sense that something had ended without anything yet arriving to replace it, the flatness that didn't feel entirely like grief. I knew that landscape. He had been living in it for months. He had a name for it, and he was treating it, in retrospect in the book, not as catastrophe, but as passage. I put the book down and sat with that for a while. Because I had been calling what I'd been through damage, the distance I felt from people I used to pour myself into, I was calling that damage, the automatic caring that used to arrive without effort and now required a kind of deliberate reaching, and sometimes didn't arrive at all even when I reached. Damage. The fact that I couldn't locate who I was without the constant work of attending to someone else's pain, damage, or possibly healing, but I genuinely couldn't tell. And from the inside, the two sensations were, I want to be honest about this, identical. Jung's framework gave me something I hadn't had before. Not comfort, not resolution, not a promise that things would return to the way they were. What it gave me was a map, a structure for the territory I was in that didn't require me to escape it faster, or perform a version of recovery I didn't feel, or keep trying to refill a tank with something I was approaching from the wrong direction entirely. Just, this is what this is. The opposite broke through. The extreme unilateral posture compensated. The question now is whether I meet that with awareness or without it, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to suggest that having the map made everything immediately clear or comfortable. It didn't. The disorientation was still there. The flatness was still there. The strangeness of not knowing who I was without the constant work of attending to someone else's pain. That didn't resolve because I read a chapter in a book. But the map changed what I did with the disorientation. Instead of trying to push through it or around it or past it, I started to sit with it differently. Not as damage to fix. As territory to understand. The question shifted from, when does this end, to, what is this pointing toward? That is a small shift. It doesn't sound like much. But in terms of what it produces over time, in terms of which of Jung's two paths you end up on, it's the entire difference. That distinction changed what I did next. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive people documented what she called the shutdown response, a protective withdrawal that the nervous system initiates when the demands placed on it exceed its sustainable threshold for processing absorbed input. For years, in clinical settings, in the caregiver literature, in the way people around you might have described the change they noticed in you, this response was consistently misread as coldness, as character change, as evidence that something had hardened in a way that couldn't reverse. It was the opposite of what those readings assumed. The shutdown response was adaptive. It was the system pulling back from the surface in order to protect what was essential underneath. Not the end of the sensitivity, the protection of it, in the only way available to it in that moment. Your system did what it needed to do to keep you here. And a 2024 meta-analysis across 82 studies, 20 years of research on recovery from compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress, found the most consistent predictor of successful recovery was not the absence of the breaking point. It was what happened after it. Individuals who reached the saturation point and recognized it as a signal, rather than trying to suppress it or endure it without any framework or simply wait for it to resolve on its own, had significantly better outcomes. Across populations, across measures, consistently. Think about what that finding actually means. Across 82 studies and 20 years of data, the single most reliable variable in whether someone recovers well from that kind of exhaustion is not how depleted they were, not how long it went on, not the severity of what they absorbed. It's whether they treated the breaking point as information rather than failure, whether they looked at the moment and asked what it was, rather than simply trying to get past it. The recognition itself was the variable. The moment doesn't determine the destination. The map does. And this is what Jung's distinction finally makes clear. Two people can pass through the same moment, the same cessation, the same loss of what used to define how they showed up, the same quality of flatness where the automatic caring used to be, and arrive in completely different places. Not because one was stronger, not because one had more psychological resources or had done more therapeutic work before the moment arrived, but because one encountered a framework for what the experience was, and one called it damage and stayed there. The coldness that might follow a moment like this, the distance, the changed relationship to care, the inability to access what used to be effortless, Jung would say, that is not damage. That is Enantiodromia in process. The compensatory force arrived. The extreme one-sidedness is being corrected. The opposite is moving. But the correction doesn't automatically produce integration. What it produces, without awareness, is replacement. One extreme traded for another. The posture of giving everything becomes the posture of giving nothing. The unilaterality is still there. It's just pointing the other way. The psyche made the correction, but possession by the opposite is not individuation. It's the same structural problem wearing a different face. What produces integration, what changes the correction into the beginning of individuation, is meeting the moment with understanding. Naming what it is. Recognizing that the opposite breaking through is not the end of capacity. It's the psyche creating space for something that couldn't exist while the previous configuration was held so rigidly in place. Individuation. Jung's term for the process of becoming genuinely oneself, as distinct from the personas and roles that form around external demands, doesn't begin from comfort. Jung wrote that it generally begins with a wounding of the personality and the suffering that accompanies it. The forced compensation broke something that needed to break. The unilaterality that had organized your life for years was not who you are. It was a posture that became load-bearing before you realized it, and the psyche eventually compensated for it. Whether what comes after is possession or individuation depends on whether the moment gets named. Not perfectly named. Not named immediately. Jung himself took months, years, to develop the map while he was standing inside the territory. The naming doesn't have to be complete or confident. It just has to be happening. The turning toward the interior landscape rather than away from it. The treating of the uncertainty as material rather than as something to survive until it ends. And here's what I've come to believe about the people who make that turn. Based on everything I've read and everything I observed in 12 years of sitting with people at the end of their lives, the capacity for that turning was never separate from the sensitivity that produced the breaking point in the first place. The same quality that made you the person who always absorbed, always attended, always reached toward someone else's distress. That quality, when it turns inward, becomes something. It doesn't disappear when the outward expression of it becomes unsustainable. It redirects. That's not a comfortable thought, because it means the sensitivity itself was never the problem. The configuration was. The direction was. But the underlying capacity, the thing that felt like it was draining you, was also the thing that, pointed inward, could do something entirely different. Jung called the goal individuation, becoming genuinely, specifically yourself. Not a better version of who you were before. Not a healed version that functions the same way, but more sustainably. Something genuinely different. The self that could only emerge after the extreme posture was corrected. The person who couldn't exist while all that energy was organized around everyone else. I think the fact that you're here, the fact that this title registered as relevant to something you've lived, that something made you click, that you stayed, already tells you something about which direction the territory is pointing. People who are simply possessed by the opposite don't ask what the mechanism was. The possession closes. It shuts the question down. The asking itself, the sustained curiosity about what actually happened and what it means, is a signal. Not that everything is resolved. Not that the things that changed are going to come back the way they were. Not that the distance will disappear. But the asking tells you that the map is being developed, that the awareness Jung described as the hinge between possession and individuation is already in motion. That's the thing worth sitting with. Jung said that the process of individuation, once initiated, doesn't reverse. The breaking point is not a door you can close once you've walked through it. The awareness, once developed, doesn't disappear. You may not feel it as progress. You may feel it as uncertainty for a long time, but the territory you're in is not empty. It has structure, and the structure has a direction. Something direct before we close. What I just walked through, the mechanism Jung identified in 1928, the distinction between forced compensation and possession by the opposite, the difference between Enantiodromia without awareness and the beginning of individuation, this isn't assembled cleanly anywhere I know of. Getting here required going into the primary sources, the essay on psychic energy in the collected works, the 2 essays on analytical psychology, the chapter on confrontation with the unconscious in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and then holding what those sources say next to what Figley documented clinically in 1995 and what Aron's research confirms about the nervous system's adaptive withdrawal. If something in this video named what you've been carrying, if the moment doesn't determine the destination, the map does, landed differently than what you expected when you clicked, a super thanks is the most direct way to tell me this work matters. It's what makes it possible to keep going to the actual sources instead of staying at the surface of these ideas. Tell me in the comments, when you hit that moment, if you've been there, did it feel like damage? Or did some part of you sense that something else was happening? I'm genuinely curious which way you landed on it first.